I'm Marshall Kozloff.
And I'm Mike Duran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance. Today we spoke with Ed Husain. Ed is from the United Kingdom. He writes and speaks on geopolitics of the Middle East, radicalization, and the West's relationship with Islam. Mike, why were you interested in speaking with Ed on these topics?
Marshall, I love this conversation we had with Ed Husain, but I got to tell you, after thinking about all the things that we did talk to him about, we only scratched the surface. Ed is one of my favorite people in the world. He's a man of enormous substance. He's very courageous, as we mentioned in the podcast. He's had death threats, but he was also an advisor to Tony Blair. Many things we didn't touch on, but what we did touch on was significant. We heard from him about the Abraham Accords, about secularization in the Islamic world, about where the Islamic world is going these days, and about the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood, about where Islam is in Europe and in Britain. I think this was an enormously rich conversation.
It was a rich conversation because Ed is clearly someone who I'd love to speak on a podcast with because he has a lot of thoughts and can engage critically with anything you bring up with him. So he clearly is thinking before he's answering. He is bringing things to the table, and he's really open to pushback and reconsidering. So everything we're really trying to get at when we're thinking of guests we want to have on this program. Now, that being said, there's a lot of really great stuff, so I think we should just jump into the episode. Of course, last but not least, huge thank you to Hudson Institute for supporting Counterbalance. We really appreciate it. Let's dive into the episode.
Let's do it. Ed Husain, welcome to Counterbalance.
Great. Thank you for having me, Mike and Marshall.
It's really wonderful to have you here. Marshall, Ed, with your permission, let me just spend a couple seconds telling Marshall why I love you. Okay? And I think I have told this story on tape before, but I'm gonna tell it again. Marshall, Ed wrote a book called The Islamist years ago, and I was in London for some reason, I don't know why, and I was listening to the radio there, and Red Ken Livingstone, former mayor of London, and extreme left-wing politician, no friend of Israel, he was on a radio program with this guy, Ed Husain, I'd never heard of before. Ed at the time was about 12 years old, maybe 11. And they got into a debate, and Ed wiped the floor with Ken Livingstone. Just wiped the floor. I got so excited listening to it. I thought, who is this young guy? And presented himself as a former Islamist, Muslim, and told Ken Livingstone that all of his ideas about the third world and Muslim versus the West and everything were just a load of hooey. And it was fantastic. And so since then, I've been in love with Ed. As time went on, I got to know him. And I won't say anything more. We'll just launch into it. Ed, what's on your mind these days?
Well, Mike, thank you for those kind words. But that influence from Ken Livingstone hasn't gone away. He's been outed for the anti-Semite that he is. He's been expelled from the British Labour Party. But that worldview of dividing each of us on the basis of factors that we cannot control. So we are seen purely on the basis of our gender, or purely on the basis of being Palestinian, or purely on the basis of our skin color, or purely on the basis of our imagined class. The thing that the people on the far left don't understand is the great secret of the white working class. They don't want to be working class. They want to move up. But Ken Livingstone and others on the far left want to keep them down there. And in that discussion, what we were trying to say is that this imagined, at least in the United Kingdom, that the most oppressed people in the UK were, for example, in his argument, Muslims, just was not factually true. It was the white working class who weren't going to university, who weren't getting jobs. And often Muslims did have much better paid jobs, say in the National Health Service and doctors and whatnot. So I think that's a big issue that's crossing all of our minds now, that the politics of not being able to transcend who we naturally are. Why should my identity be limited to just being a man, or just being a Muslim, or just being a Brit? I am a full human being, and most importantly, I am a citizen of a nation state. And that's my public contract. I have rights and I have responsibilities. Yes, I have freedom, but I have duties. And I think that's something that's bothering me increasingly, because we're seeing right across our campuses, but also in our political culture, the eradication of the citizen and the contract that we have with each other as free citizens under a nation state, rather than, a new tribalism is kicking in, Mike. So that's something that's on my mind. The other thing is the Abraham Accords and the importance and yet the fragility of the Accords. And I think the third thing is that this is the 20th year of the 9/11 horrendous terrorist attacks, and all of us have put our books away and are beginning to think that terrorism is somehow firmly behind us. We thought like that 10 years ago when the Arab Spring happened. Democracy has now arrived to the Middle East, only to be reminded that ISIS emerged. And I'm worrying and I'm fearful about what is to come, as COVID and China and other issues rightly distract us. That there's a great saying in America, isn't there? That can you chew gum and walk at the same time? And I think that's what's required now, to chew gum, look in multiple directions, and walk at the same time.
Yeah, and before we were starting the taping of this episode, you put it frankly when you said we seem to have put terrorism-related issues on the back burner. Can you just contextualize and operationalize what that means to you? So is it that the US, the UK aren't engaged in the spaces that you used to cover during the 2000s or 2010s? What does that mean to you, really?
A great question, Marshall. I think, ordinarily in any given year, both in the US, UK, and further afield in Europe, there would be top-level political intervention and policy guidance on two fronts. One, where the terrorist threat is coming from, what the numbers are, where the theaters of operations are, and why. And two, what governments on both sides of the Atlantic are doing to counter the threat, but also the ideology and the narrative behind the threat. Both of those two things have now been downgraded. The political bandwidth, be it for the White House or be it for Downing Street here, does not want to include. We haven't had a more serious terrorist threat. If we just take this country, the United Kingdom, from where I speak today, we have in excess of 41,000 potential terrorist operatives who are being looked at by the intelligence agencies on a daily basis. That was not the case.
41,000? Yes. Of which 95% are Islamist related. 5% sorry, I don't want to far right. I don't want to interrupt you here, but I just want to emphasize that when I worked in the Defense Department, which is about 2008, I worked closely with some British counterparts, and they told me then that they had about 20,000 cases that they were following, and they indicated that they were totally overloaded. So this is remarkable what you're saying. Yes. Now, Mike, add that to the pressures of the refugee flows from North Africa, but also from Syria across the Mediterranean. Add that to the French elections coming up next year, when President Macron has had to tilt much further to the right than he's ordinarily comfortable with. So all of that is in the mix, and our politicians generally aren't paying attention. And so, Marshall, I hope that kind of clarifies some of the concerns in terms of, operationally, the intelligence agencies, as Mike says, are stretched. Operationally, the government here at least has something called the Prevent Agenda, which is to stop people from walking the pathway from radicalization to terrorism to start with. Now, that's under heavy sustained attack from the activists. Operationally, we've got in excess of 2,000 mosques, the vast majority of which are not regulated. And we're seeing debates in France to regulate what happens in those public spaces. So there's a whole range of issues that are just staring at us. And on top of all of that, we've got, real challenges of ideological support for creating a fracture inside the West by using Muslims as almost Trojan horses, whether it's the Russians or whether it's the Iranians and others. So
those are the kind of challenges that we're looking at. And due to COVID, due to the change of administration in the US, due to the economic difficulties, I mean, those are understandable challenges. We are not able to keep our eye on the threat that the moment our people are back on the trains, back on the planes, and back in the marketplaces again, what does terrorism look like?
And let's play with the walking and chewing gum at the same time idea, because it's aside from its American origin, it's a very useful way of thinking about these foreign policy issues. Most of our episodes of Counterbalance have focused on great power competition with China, whether that's in Australia, whether that's with former Trump administration officials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you're looking at the terrorist threat that Rui defined the early first quarter of the 21st century, and then the increasing rhetoric around competition with China, how do you think those issues are balanced? From a framework, do you think it's possible to balance these types of threats from an attention perspective? Because it seems to swing from one side to the other frequently.
Yes. Again, a great question, Marshall. In my mind, I think that we're missing a trick here, in that one of the ways in which, however mistaken, the Soviet Union was weakened was by using, quote unquote, the Islamic world, Pakistan, the Taliban, and their precursors. I mean, the CIA was operative in unleashing hell on the Soviet Union and the Russians in Afghanistan. Now, conversely, now we've got millions of Muslims from a Uyghur background in China, and that issue hasn't received sufficient attention in order to say, 1.8 billion Muslims, 57 nation states should also be pointing their guns and their resources against China, rather than be on the receiving end of Chinese vaccines and on the receiving end of Chinese aid and Chinese infrastructure in most of these countries, and emulating the Chinese model of collectivism, of silence, of the lack of freedom. And I think there's been a real opportunity that's being missed repeatedly, that the West should not be alone in confronting China. I was speaking to a journalist friend today in Saudi Arabia, and she said, "Oh, it's great that you're reading a book." I was reading Henry Kissinger's book on China, just to understand where we went wrong and right on China, by the way, from Nixon years. And she was saying, it's great that you're interested in China, because we simply are not. China doesn't matter to us. China's an ally. And therein lies a real problem, that you've got 1.8 billion people, many of whom, by the way, have countries that are on China's northern borders, all those stans, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, Pakistan. Then you add to that, you talked about great power play. You add to that India, 1.2 billion people with the Himalayas and that border. So what I'm saying is that China can be contained from its south with all of the, whether it's Taiwan or whether it's the tensions China has had over years with Vietnam and with the Philippines, or with the North-South Korea issue, or the centuries-long challenge from Japan. But then you've also got, its northern borders with Russia and 5 Muslim countries. All of that hasn't been mobilized to contain the dragon. Instead, we're on the receiving end of some of its fire when we should not be. And that's where I think, yes, there's the great power play with China, but it should not be something that the West is facing alone, and it should be faced with all of its allies, including India and the wider Muslim world.
I saw Secretary of State Tony Blinken said the other day that when talking about China, that he said that China and the United States have the same interests with regard to Iran. And that disturbed me greatly to hear that, because my view is that the Chinese are using the Iranians against us very cleverly and subtly, very subtly, because they're, if you, like you say, you have a friend, a journalist in Saudi Arabia, who's not aware of the fact that they are being used, that they are being driven to Beijing by the support that Beijing is giving to Iran. I mean, one of the things that they're doing, the Chinese are, in my view, propping up the Iranians. The Chinese are gonna today. They're gonna sell more or this month, March, they're going to sell more oil to Iran. I'm sorry, Iran is going to sell more oil to China than they have at any time since Trump left the JCPOA. So they are, without ever saying a word about the negotiations between Washington and Tehran about rejoining the JCPOA, they are giving the Iranians the wherewithal to hold out against the Americans and either demand a higher price from the American side or just never consent to the negotiations at all, depending upon what they want to do. I don't know how they're going to play it, but they get away with it. I mean, it's not just that the journalist in Saudi Arabia is unaware of it. The American Secretary of State is unaware of it. It's remarkable.
Yes, you used two adjectives when you were describing the Chinese strategy, Mike. You said that they were both clever and subtle, and that's fully in keeping with Chinese centuries-long tradition of how they play against what they call the Western barbarians, the barbarians from the West Seas. Whether it was the MacArthur mission from Britain seeking trade and seeking an embassy, which was rejected by the Chinese emperor in the 19th century, or whether it was the attempts by Henry Kissinger in the early days to open up towards from the Nixon administration towards China. There was a constant attempt to play power off against power, and that the Chinese don't have in the Judeo-Christian West or the broader Abrahamic Muslim civilizations. We have a clear concept of cosmic creation and a cosmic ending. We have a clear notion of what victory looks like. There's a clear understanding of what a clash and how that should be framed. That's not how the Chinese see the world. There's no beginning, there's no ending. It's not a game of chess. It's not moving your pieces to a checkmate position. It's just slowly, subtly, cleverly surrounding your enemies with strategic weaknesses that over time renders them unable to launch any physical, psychological, or economic warfare against you. And that's what we don't understand. It's a slow, decades-long process. We're thinking in clear kind of Aristotelian, evidence-based, empirical, black and white terms which have to be agreed upon by a democratic population before the next election. It's a very clear deadline. That's not how the Chinese think. And
absolutely,
that's part of our problem. We don't appreciate the Chinese mind.
I'm just thinking about that. I think is pretty interesting is earlier you referred to the Muslim world, and I think you may have used air quotes when you were describing it. So the discussion of what does a population of 1.8 billion people look like. Obviously, this isn't like the Chinese example where there's, a civilizational history going back 5,000 plus years. How do you think in your work, in this conversation, how do you think about what constitutes the Muslim world? Like what is it? How does it feel about things? How does shared history work? How does shared history not work? Is there a real separation between the Asian experience, the more North African experience? How do you think about that?
Yes, it's a very complicated question that requires a very complicated answer, but well identified for. The Muslim world is not a monolith, hence my attempts at putting it in quotation marks, because it has 56 nation states. It has hundreds of different cultures. It has hundreds of different languages. And, for a long time, the Muslim experience in the West, the Muslim West, which was Cordoba or Andalusia, was much more in line with its exposure to Catholic Europe and those interactions, some of it fractious, but, by and large, the Jewish experience there was different, say, from the Jewish experience in other parts of Europe. Similarly, Muslims in Indonesia, on the far east of the Muslim world, are radically different from Muslims in, say, Bosnia or Morocco. But something unites those 1.8 billion people, and that includes the belief in one God, the belief in scripture, Arabic scripture from what was recorded of the Prophet Muhammad, a belief in the afterlife, the belief in the cosmic creation and ending period, similar to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and those basic tenets of charity and eating what's kosher or halal meat. So there's immense similarity with the Judeo-Christian tradition. What else unites Muslims? Perhaps, and this is where I think the danger emerges. On a personal religious point of view, fine. All of those things may unite someone from Bosnia to Bengal to Indonesia to Malaysia to Saudi Arabia. But when we start to imagine them as a political bloc, this is where Marxist notions of the workers of the world unite started to influence Muslim thinkers in the 1920s, that it became, no, we won't accept workers of the world unite. We'll instead say, Muslims of the world unite. And that's where the danger is, that 56 nation states should be exactly that, 56 nation states, and not emerge into one kind of global politicized bloc. Call it a caliphate, call it anything else. But it's, we've seen it doesn't work. We saw it with East Pakistan and West Pakistan. We saw it with Albania. We saw it with other Balkan nations. We're seeing it with Jordan, and we're seeing attempts at nation states with the Palestinians. I can give you many, many examples where obliterating borders don't work. So my point is that the moment we go down the route of saying this is just one massive political bloc, hence my reluctance to use the Muslim world, but there is something called 1.8 billion Muslims who share a faith-based affiliation. The danger is that then we empower the hardliners to say, this is what being Muslim means. And then you find the Iranians and others defining Muslims as being against the West. And that's why I feel deeply uncomfortable, because much more unites the West with Muslims, in stark contrast, say, to civilization in India, which is much more Hindu oriented, or civilization in China, which is much more Confucian and has a different narrative. If anything, we should identify those as different civilizations rather than see Muslims as somehow the inherent other, because I see much more alignment between Muslims. And that's why I think that the threat from China is something over which Muslims in the West ought to identify commonality and confront this threat, rather than be played off by the Chinese Communist Party against one another.
When I worked in the government, I used to try to convince people not to talk about the Muslim world for the reason you're saying. I said, an American president, an American official should never address people as Muslims. It should be the doctors of Baghdad. You should always have groups of people who actually know each other in confined areas, in limited areas, at most a nation state, and not these big abstractions. Precisely for what you're saying, they empower all the wrong people. Let me take you back for a second, though, to you were talking about the terrorist threat in Britain, and let me ask you two questions. The first of which is, have you yourself been targeted or threatened? I would assume that you have. Have you, or have you not?
In the past, yes. And that's one of the reasons why I had to move to America, to maintain a lower profile here. And I've got a book coming out in June, which will probably make me a target in the minds of some, because I'm critical of the doctrine, dogma, and structures in mosques. So I was a target. Thankfully, I enjoy a degree of anonymity now, but it might come back. I mean, there's just a deeply bedded intolerance, Mike, in large sections of the activists. Not all Muslims. Most Muslims just get on with their lives, pay their mortgage, look forward to the next holiday. But there is an activist core that can't tolerate dissent. Sorry, what was going to be a second point?
Well, that was it. No, I just assumed that you had been. I didn't know that when you came over and you were at the Council on Foreign Relations for a few years, I didn't know that there was that background to it. But I was in about, again, 2008, when I was working in the Defense Department, I went over to Britain, and I was a guest for a day of the British police, and they gave me a very fascinating tour. That they were talking to me about the terrorism problem, and they talked about a lot of their programs to deal with it. And they took me to I can no longer remember where it was. Too bad I don't keep notes. My memory's no good. They took me to a youth center somewhere.
In Walthamstow.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
That's their favorite youth center that they like taking people.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's that. Yeah, it's also that predictable. But carry on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You're less special than you thought you were, Mike.
No. It's not that. I just Of course he would. Of course Ed would know. But so there was a guy there. One of the I guess they're extremists that they work with, that they trotted out. And I said, I asked him, what do you think of of Ed Husain and Majid Nawaz, and he got visibly disturbed and said, that you were not Muslims, you and Majid, and I assumed then that looking at his response, which I don't think was canned at all, it just gave me a sense of the kind of environment in which you've been operating, pushing these ideas that there are that we shouldn't be identified simply by our primordial identities. That there are deep shared aspects of shared culture between us, and so on. There are a lot of people who don't want to hear that message at all.
Yes, well, that's exactly the message that made the modern West what it is. The reason why the West has emerged to this point in history is because it focused on what makes us human, that our relationship with God is a private relationship. I mean, I'm proudly Muslim. But that's not the guy in Walthamstow's business. That's between me and God. In the public domain, our bond is one of citizens, and we have mutual rights and responsibilities. And it's interesting, Mike, that you and I were together at the United Arab Emirates when the Pope was visiting. I mean, no one said there that you weren't Catholic and I wasn't Muslim. And I go to Turkey, I go to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and no one says that. But it's only here in England that we've managed to create an ethos in which these most hard, by the way, and also in France, these most hardline, intolerant individuals seem to thrive. And that's, in Turkey now, they're expelling Muslim Brotherhood leaders and activists, and some of them are going to be washing up on our shores. And it's because we can't assert why the West is special, why the West is different. I mean, I could live in China. All of us, Mike and Marshall, could live in China for 20, 25, 30 years, and we would not be Chinese. But we would all be American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand citizens, because there's something special here in the West, which we must preserve and protect. And that goes all the way back to the year 212, when the Roman emperor granted citizenship to about 3 million people overnight, based on values, based on upholding Rome, based on shared ideals. And that's what is at stake today by, on the one side, these Islamist extremists who see us purely on the basis of faith and want to dismiss that faith. And secondly, by the far left that wants to see us only as working class, or only as women, or only as gay, or only as transsexual, or whatever people want to be. Good luck to you. It's a free world, but that doesn't form my only uncompromised public identity.
Yeah, and the thing is, I'm curious, considering your background, what was it like covering the Muslim world in the Middle East during the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and then transitioning into the period we are in now? Because I think we really started with the conversation about how the narratives are shifting, how the conceptions are really there. I'm curious what the experience was, and then also on the analytical side of things.
Yeah, Marshall, I've got to be honest. I could give you an answer that's politicized and caveated and keeps everyone happy, but it's not the truth. But the truth is, when President Obama left the White House, 3 large sections of the Middle East, especially the Middle East. You asked about the Muslim world. I'll zoom in onto the Middle East because it's from there. It's almost like the beating heart. It's from there that people kind of derive their attitudes, in relation to Israel or Palestine or Saudi Arabia. When President Obama left, the Turks were generally unhappy for a whole range of reasons. The Arabs were certainly unhappy for their valid observations, and Israel was deeply disgruntled. The only grouping in the Muslim world, or the Middle East in particular, were happy about the Obama years were the Iranians. And now, when President Trump was in power for 4 years, now I'm not denying the fact that he made many mistakes internally, that he had his flaws, whether they were personality-wise or they were policy-wise. But you asked me about the Middle East and the wider Muslim world. What Trump left behind was the total opposite. The Israelis were absolutely jubilant. The Arabs were ecstatic because they had new peace deals, they had much better defense, that they had access to the White House and to their allies, they felt protected. And the Turks generally felt that they had an ally that understood them and their terrorist threats from the PKK and the Gulen movement. They had someone in the White House that understood what it meant to be under siege. And the Iranians were on the run. For the first time since the Green Movement in 2009 or 2010, you saw in Iran significant pressure on the clerics and their allies and proxies, be it Hezbollah, be it the Houthis, be it the regime in Damascus, or indeed be it Hamas. They were on the back foot. ISIS collapsed. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was destroyed. Qasim Soleimani was assassinated. For all of those reasons, the Iranians were worried, and all of the allies of the US, the Turks, the Israelis, and the Arabs were jubilant. And that's how you treat allies. You carry them along and you support them. That's why they're your allies. But there was a flip, sadly, in the Obama years. And I think there's genuine concern now that unless we change course, we're going to be emerging back into that space, which asks a bigger question. And that question is, why should the rest of the world align itself with the West and with America if at their deepest and most needy moments we abandon them and our enemies feel supported and bolstered, but our allies feel neglected? And that's where I think China, again, offers a model where it will not ask any questions about human rights. It will not ask any questions about where investment is made. It will not ask questions about journalistic freedoms. It will support its allies. And Russia's done exactly that: uncaveated, unconditional support for Syria, propped up the regime. The regime's enemies, allies of the West, lost. So I think that there's a real big issue. It's not just about the Muslim world, although your question was very thoughtful on the Muslim world. It's what it means for the West and who we are for our allies and our enemies.
On that question of allies and enemies, let's turn to the Abraham Accords. Before we do, let me just say, Ed, everything you just said, I agree with 100%. There have been times since I've known you when we haven't been 100% in agreement. I won't resurrect those old arguments, but
I would. That's interesting. Within reason, I'm curious what the debates between the two of you, what they were.
Well, I believe that Ed and I we differed significantly for a little while over the Syrian civil war, and I don't want to put words in Ed's mouth. Ed, do you want to?
No, Mike's view when you were at NYU, Mike, I think your view was that the Syrian regime would fall. And my view was that I think it was too deeply embedded among its population, and it used the most unexpected and the harshest methods, and it would survive.
That's interesting, because that's not how I remember it. But you may well be right. I have a very simple view of the Middle East, of the American role in the Middle East, and it's exactly the one that you just presented. Support allies, punish enemies. The number one enemy of the United States in the Middle East is Iran.
And by the way, Mike and Marshall, forgive me for interrupting you. We should never lose sight of the fact that there is no other country on the planet that makes a weekly prayer of saying, death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews, death to the West. Not just Iran, but it's called the Ansar Allah, the Houthi guys in Yemen. I mean, we're not making this up. This is just a fact. And people think we're Iran obsessives, that we have a bias. I mean, we don't. It's just, if you have a government and if you have 80 million people and your allies in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and elsewhere, that wants to see the end of the United States and its allies, attacks our allies, i.e. the Saudis and Israel and other allies in the region. We can't just stand back and say, how do we appease you? What do we do to make your life easy? How do we lift sanctions? And I mean, what that says, sadly, to 400 million Arabs, Turks, and others in the region, is that America can't be relied upon. And that has real consequences. Sorry, Mike, for interrupting you.
No, you didn't interrupt me. I was just agreeing with you. Let's go to the Abraham Accords, because you made a name for yourself. You said that the Gulf states were ready to make peace with Israel long before they did. You advocated it. You advocated it loudly. And you said Muslims wanted it in the Gulf, and it wasn't just the states that wanted it; the people wanted it. Your view has been totally vindicated. Your prognostication totally vindicated. So, but now it looks like the Abraham Accords are in a little bit of trouble. So I'm just like to have you tell us a little bit about what the Abraham Accords meant to you and where you see things going.
The Abraham Accords, Mike, were personal. They were personal because for the last 10 years, 15 years, we've been lectured by people who frankly loathe any faith. And it was unloading their hatred, particularly on Islam, and saying there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim. And the ultimate test was, again and again, I heard it in Washington, D.C. and New York, at those fancy dinner parties and at that elite level. They can't make peace with Israel. And I would say to them that you're wrong. And they would say, well, prove us wrong. And I'd say, well, look at Egypt, look at Jordan, look at attempts at Morocco. And they say, oh, well, they don't really matter. So it was something really personal when, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Oman, there was such warmth and willingness to engage, not just with Jewish people from America and Europe, but with Israel and Israelis themselves. When I'd go from Jerusalem into the Gulf countries, it was as though I'd come from heaven. People want to know every last detail. What is it like? What are the walls like? What are the people like? What's the history like? What are they excavating? When can we go? There was a real desperation at the highest levels in the Gulf. Ministers would say to, the very top echelon.
We should just tell the listeners that you played a role behind the scenes, and you were going back and forth. You just said it, but you were going back and forth from Israel to the Gulf. And so we're a kind of a facilitator
we shouldn't say any more because I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said, if you have to say you're a lady, then you're not a lady.
I was a huge deal. Just you see.
Sometimes these things just best left unspoken, and just let them be, because I think the real issue is we've got more to do. That's the point. The moment you start making claims you've done this, you lose trust. And I think the real deal here is to get Saudi Arabia. It may not be the Abraham Accords. It may be the Ishmael Accords, or the Isaac Accords, or the Moses Accords. But it doesn't really matter. It's making peace between the children of Abraham, or maybe the Jesus Accords. So there's more to be done. The real worry, though, is this, Mike, and you put your finger on the pulse, that there are attempts now to, firstly, make it known that somehow the Abraham Accords were not particularly welcomed or endorsed by elements of the Biden administration, and that worries me. We whatever politics we have with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he might be too right-leaning for some of the more left-leaning individuals in the administration. You don't jeopardize something that has made history, something that has secured Israel and Jerusalem, and ultimately something that brings peace and stability in the Middle East, and thereby saves American lives, American treasure, and offsets terrorist attacks. That long-range view hasn't been built in. Secondly, stemming from the inability to take a kind of more non-partisan, long-range view on this issue, there's been an active attempt to punish people who are involved, the politicians who are involved in the Abraham Accords and the countries that were involved in the Abraham Accords. I mean, the way Bibi Netanyahu was treated without being phoned, for those many days, the way in which his flights have been blocked into the countries that he wants to visit, the way in which messages have been asked to be put out against Bibi Netanyahu who's being re-electing. I mean, all of that smacks of university campus politics rather than grown-up, sincere, civilized allies who are supportive of what their Arab and Israeli friends have done, and encouraging Saudi Arabia to do the same, encouraging the Egyptians and Jordanians to have an open and warm peace from people to people. because that's ultimately what weakens the Iranians and Al Qaeda and ISIS and others in the change of narrative. My fear is what we're doing at the moment is almost saying to Iran that you carry on with your support for extremists who are on the borders of Israel, i.e. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, and there's no punishment for you. Your narrative doesn't get rebuked. You can carry on shouting death to America, shouting death to Israel, keep lobbing rockets across the border from Gaza and from Yemen into Saudi Arabia and from Gaza into Israel, and we'll take you more seriously. There's a lack of awareness of what all of that does, not just for our allies and ultimately for ourselves. And one last point, Mike, if I may, is that, and Marshall, is that here in the West, we have 30 million Muslims who live here. It's not an accident that large numbers of French Jewish people are leaving France, where there's been an increase of activist Muslims moving into parts of whether it's Brussels or whether it's France, or indeed whether it's Manchester. There's been a decrease in the number of students at the University of Manchester because there's been an increase of activist, Arabized, angry young Muslims. That correlation on our campuses and what happens in the Middle East means that we here in the West enjoy greater security because we end the centuries-old hatred for the great Jewish people. We make the point that the Jewish people are the ancestors of Christianity, but also of Islam. And there's a much deeper point, I think, that's being sadly missed. And you're right to ask, Mike, and it remains to be seen where these current attempts to undermine and be subversive towards the peace accords take us.
As we're nearing the end here, let's take the spirit of your advocacy for peace between Israel and Muslim states and articulate for us where you think the opportunities are, regardless of administration, moving forward. So whether it's 2 terms of Joe Biden, whether it's 1 term Joe Biden, where is the broad opportunity in this space?
The broad opportunity here is, and again, I'm not being political. I'm trying to speak the truth. And I think those of us who are interested in seeking the truth that reflects in our policies and therefore gives America and its allies the moral high ground. And you're right, Marshall, to say don't look at the electoral and the political cycle here. Is that we have a once in a century opportunity to correct the misdemeanors that have come out of the Middle East and created global terrorism and hatred for the West. The last time we had this kind of big opportunity was in the 1920s when Kemal Ataturk in Turkey not only demolished the caliphate, but tried to modernize the Muslim world. So that was the last century in which we saw this opportunity. And, to some extent he succeeded, and in many ways he failed. But now, again, in the 2020s, we have this opportunity to realign the relationship between 1.8 billion Muslims and where are we? Almost 800, 900 million people here in the West. And therefore, the focus ought to be on Saudi Arabia. That country matters. This is not just about Mohammed bin Salman. This is not just about a journalist being killed in Turkey. It's much bigger than that, because we are getting distracted by the skirmishes and ignoring the long-term strategic direction of the war. We will lose the war because we're fighting a skirmish. The skirmish was the killing of a journalist, unjust, wrong, undeniably brutal killing of Jamal Khashoggi. But that doesn't then mean you throw the baby of reform with the bathwater and lose an ally in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia matters because 1.8 billion Muslims turn towards Mecca to pray 5 times a day. Saudi Arabia matters because it gave us the global headache of Wahhabism and Salafi terrorism, because it was able to export that from the 1940s onwards. Now reverse that and imagine a Saudi Arabia which is pro-gender rights, pro-West, pro-human equality, pro-freedom, pro-justice. Over time, you see a reformed Saudi Arabia, you see a reformed world of Islam. It's not complicated, and yet we're missing that long-range strategic view and we're getting distracted by skirmishes.
That's a fabulous vision. And I wonder if I can ask you to unpack it a little bit, because I think you've made some associations that may not be clear to all of our listeners. I'm not sure they're clear to me, in fact. When you say we are missing the opportunity with Saudi Arabia, you're talking not just about Mohammed bin Salman and his reforms domestically, but also the Abraham Accords. Is that right?
Indeed.
So can you just very simply, in the way that you just did, explain to us how the Abraham Accords translates into all that you're saying, into a kind of revectoring of, or reconfiguration of, the relations between the United States or the West and the Muslim countries of the Middle East?
The Abraham Accord is the sharpest, the most strategic, the most sustained refutation of the narrative of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most active and the most populist Islamist, anti-Western, anti-Israeli, anti-capitalist organization in the Muslim world. The Abraham Accord says that the children of Abraham, Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live together side by side in peace. The Abraham Accord says that anyone who opposes Israel is in fact opposing the emergence of the three great Abrahamic faiths that have shaped the modern world. For Saudi Arabia to sign a peace arrangement and a peace agreement and normalize relationships with Israel says to 1.8 billion Muslims that the mindset of boycotting Israel and the BDS movement that's tried to make headway on some campuses is entirely flawed, because if the Saudis and Arabs can make peace with Israel, who are Pakistanis or Indonesians or Bosnians or others to oppose not just the existence of Israel, but Western support for Israel? And more importantly, Mike, the Abraham Accords facilitated by the United States and other future accords that will be facilitated, hopefully, and marshaled by the US, is to say that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and those who are kind of atheists in our culture, even those who say they're atheists, they're atheists within our culture. We're not saying this is just an arrangement and a worldview for people of faith, because faith is a gift from God. Some have it, some don't. What we're saying is that clash of civilizations that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian government have advocated for the last many decades is null and void, that American lives are saved, that America does not need to expend more blood and treasure in Baghdad, in Beirut, that Arabs can then turn to rectifying Damascus and Baghdad and the many other capitals which are near collapse. So this has real ramifications, both for the US and for the Middle East. And it's not just about Bibi Netanyahu, and it's not just about Mohammed bin Salman. It's much, much bigger civilizational project.
Well, that's extremely well said. Thank you so much. Marshall, do you have anything you want to ask Ed?
Yeah, just to close us out, I really liked that towards the start of the episode when you were discussing terrorism on the back burner. It's obviously been a horrific year with COVID. Are there any other issues that you cover and focus on that you feel were put on the back burner as a consequence of everything?
Yes, who we are. We've forgotten who we are. The fact that I'm brown, I'm Muslim, and I can thrive in the English-speaking West. We should not take that for granted, Marshall. My fear is out there. You go to India. I've spent a lot of time in Egypt in the heat of the Arab Spring, and despite all the flag burning of the West, flag burning, the American flag, or attacks on the U.S. embassy in Tunisia, there were still long crowds of people wanting to come into the U.S. and we have boats entering the UK on a daily basis from many countries, and I worry that we are forgetting who we are, that we are inheritors of a civilization and a tradition that goes back all the way to Socrates, that includes Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. We are inheritors of a long tradition that was defended with 2 world wars. And what we've come to now is, at least in my country, the madness to want to destroy Winston Churchill's statue. The allegation that somehow Jefferson was racist. we can't judge the past by our standards, and by doing so, what we are doing is destroying the very pillars on which our home, Western civilization, stands. And when we forget who we are, we empower our enemies in China and in Iran to bring about our downfall. And we should look back and say that the lifestyles that we all lead, despite all of our chaos, is the freedom that only kings dreamt of, be it in Persia or ancient Rome. We enjoy securities and freedoms that ancient monarchs could only dream of, never mind their citizens. And we should be very careful about repudiating and destroying that inheritance that we have from the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the two world wars, and literally the light of liberty that America continues to uphold at home and abroad.
What I happen to know that you have a special interest in Edmund Burke. Why do you hone in this context on Edmund Burke?
Because thank you for asking that, Mike, because Burke, he was a religious Protestant Christian, but he understood that not all change and not all talk of progress led to progress and change. He supported the American Revolution because he knew these were people who had the rule of law, and they were standing against an unjust king in King George III, and they were right in their demands. And he foresaw that America will continue to be a land of the English language, of liberty and laws. And he was right. But he opposed with every fiber in his being the French Revolution, because he saw that was not just an attack on the Catholic Church, it was in essence an attack on Christianity, on faith, on tradition, on monarchy. And he used the word terrorism. We started our conversation on the word terrorism. He coined that word because he saw that the French revolutionaries were what he called advocating an armed worldview. And he knew that would lead to terrorism. And he was right. It was almost prophetic. And for me, Burke is not just because he was a Whig, he was a progressive, and he was a conservative, conserving the most important elements of civilization, but also because he's relevant to the Middle East today. In the Middle East, change should not be revolution and overnight democracy and do away with all the monarchies. In the Middle East, Edmund Burke is powerful because he calls on us to conserve and preserve what allows for societies to thrive. So you find the compromise between the masses, the clerics, the business elites, but most importantly, the monarchy. And I think for those reasons, Burke was important then, and he is now. And for me as a Brit and someone who's broadly in that Whiggish tradition, he allowed us to understand liberty and why he was able to support America, support the injustices that the Brits undertook in India, support the Irish calls for Catholic emancipation and moving away from England, but he opposed the French Revolution, and most importantly, he supported the British monarchy. So there was this balanced approach to national and international affairs that I think that only Burke offers us in our troubled times too.
No, really well said. Ed, thank you so much for joining. I'm happy that you and Mike were able to semi-adjudicate the disagreement and keep us moving forward and everything like that. Thanks again.
Ed's memory of the disagreement is interesting because it allows us both, to have been right.
Yes, on that diplomatic note, we're both being right.
Who knows?
All right, Marshall. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Before you go, Ed, what's you got a book coming out in? Tell us what it is. When's it coming out, and what's it about?
It's coming out on June the 10th. It's called Among the Mosques: A Journey Across Muslim Britain. It's taking the temperature on freedom in Britain. Testing it against those great open liberal ideas, testing them against where we are in our communities. There's interesting findings. There's lots of good news and some bad news.
You went through the different mosques all around Britain?
Yes, all around the four nations. It's me, the anthropologist.
How fantastic. What a great idea.
Yes.
Okay. So you're going to be an object, you're going to be a target for terrorists again, huh?
Oh, God forbid. God forbid. It's we've got to win the war of ideas. We've got to win the war of ideas. Human reason, individualism has got to win over the kind of collectivism of one mob. They can't wipe us out. So anyway, so you'll see me in America soon again, because every time the hatred increases here, I take shelter in the great nation that's the United States.
I think the mob mentality that you oppose is on the rise here, unfortunately. So you may have to go to Israel or somewhere else. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, God bless you guys.
Right.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed.
We
Best
Good
of
to
luck.
really
meet
appreciate having
Marshall.
you.
Speak soon. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.
Hope you all enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to learn more about Counterbalance and the work of Hudson Institute, go to hudson.org. We really appreciate all the support and the awesome feedback on the show, so be sure to rate us 5 stars, share with friends and family who are interested in learning more about foreign policy and world affairs, and we will see you all next week.